Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the man who said civilization broke us. Today's thinker wrote some of the most influential words about freedom in human history, and by most honest accounts of his own life, was a genuinely difficult, sometimes deeply hypocritical person to actually know. Both of those things are true at once, and neither one cancels the other out.
Which is exactly why Jean-Jacques Rousseau, pronounced Rousseau, is one of the hardest thinkers in this whole series to summarize fairly. He is the philosopher of natural freedom, whose own children ended up in an orphanage. Stick with that discomfort, because it matters for understanding him honestly.
Let us start with the core idea, because it is genuinely striking. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains.
That opening line, from the Social Contract, published in 1762, is one of the most quoted sentences in political philosophy, and it captures Rousseau's central claim. Human beings, in some more natural condition, he argued, were not the violent, calculating creatures Hobbes described. They were relatively simple, self-sufficient, and largely peaceful, driven by basic needs and a natural, uncultivated compassion for other suffering creatures. It is society itself, Rousseau argued, private property, hierarchy, comparison, vanity, that corrupted this natural goodness and locked people into competition, envy, and inequality.
And here is where it gets genuinely paradoxical, because Rousseau does not simply condemn property and walk away.
He does something much more interesting and much harder to pin down. In his earlier work, he treats the first person who fenced off a piece of land and said this is mine as basically the origin of nearly all human misery, the moment natural equality broke and inequality began compounding. But by the time he writes the Social Contract, he is not calling for abolishing property or government. He is trying to design a form of government that could make organized society legitimate anyway, built around what he calls the general will, the collective interest of a community when its members set aside pure private self-interest and will the common good together.
Walk us through that idea, because general will is one of those phrases people use constantly without really defining it.
The general will is meant to be different from simply adding up everyone's individual preferences, what Rousseau calls the will of all. It is supposed to represent what the community genuinely shares as a common interest, once petty self-interest is stripped away. In theory, that sounds like a beautiful foundation for real democracy, legitimate authority resting on the people themselves, rather than an inherited crown. In practice, it turns out to be one of the most dangerous phrases in the history of political thought, because it can be used to claim that dissenters do not actually understand their own true interest, and can therefore be, in Rousseau's own unsettling phrase, forced to be free.
That phrase alone should make everyone listening sit up a little straighter.
It should, and it did immediately, once his ideas reached revolutionary France a generation later. Rousseau's language of popular sovereignty and the general will become genuine intellectual fuel for the French Revolution, quoted constantly by revolutionaries who saw themselves as finally realizing his vision of a legitimate, people-centered government. But the same logic, that anyone opposing the general will is opposing the true interest of the people, also got invoked to justify the Terror, the period where the revolution began executing its own former allies as enemies of the people. That is the honest, complicated legacy. Not Rousseau causing the terror single-handedly, historians rightly resist that oversimplification, but his framework proving dangerously easy to weaponize once real power was on the table.
And his own life adds another whole layer of complication.
It really does, and serious biographers do not paper over it. Rousseau wrote passionately, and quite beautifully, about natural childhood development and the importance of a nurturing upbringing in his book Émile. And in his own life, he fathered 5 children with his companion Thérèse Levasseur and sent every one of them to a foundling hospital, the 18th century version of an orphanage, largely because he felt unable to raise them properly himself. He wrote about this later with what reads like genuine guilt and self-justification tangled together. You do not have to forgive it to understand it, and you do not have to throw out his political ideas because of it either. Both facts sit there, uncomfortably at the same time.
Let us bring this down to something people can actually feel in their own lives, because general will sound abstract until you have lived through a small version of it.
Think about a homeowners association. A small group of neighbors agrees to a shared set of rules for the common good: lawn heights, paint colors, shared amenities, and in principle it is a lovely, tiny experiment in collective self-governance, everyone consenting to modest constraints for the sake of the whole neighborhood. And almost everyone who has actually lived under one knows how quickly that can curdle. A small committee deciding it alone understands the true best interest of the community, overriding individual homeowners, punishing dissenters, insisting its rulings represent everyone's real, well, even when plenty of actual residents furiously disagree. That is Rousseau's general will. Shrunk down to scale, you can genuinely picture tyranny of the majority wearing a very ordinary, unglamorous face.
There is also a bigger historical parallel worth pulling in here, beyond just the French Revolution.
It is worth comparing Rousseau's romantic vision of natural goodness against a completely different historical current, the Industrial Revolution unfolding not long after his death, which many later thinkers argued alienated workers from nature, from their own labor, and from each other in exactly the way Rousseau feared society inevitably would. Rousseau was writing before factories, before industrial cities, and yet his instinct that organized, hierarchical society could estrange people from something more authentic in themselves became one of the most persistent themes running straight through 19th and 20th century thought.
Which brings us to a very live, very current debate.
There is a whole modern conversation, sometimes serious and academic, sometimes half-joking on social media, about whether modern technology and constant connectivity are doing to us exactly what Rousseau feared society itself was doing, pulling us away from something more natural, more direct, more genuinely human. Debates about smartphone addiction, about whether curated online life breeds the exact vanity and comparison Rousseau blamed for corrupting natural goodness, are, whether people realize it or not, Rousseauian arguments in a completely new costume.
And there is an even sharper current events angle, isn't there, around populism,
Very sharp and worth being careful and even-handed about, because it cuts across the political spectrum rather than belonging to one side. Populist movements, across many different countries and many different ideologies, regularly claim to speak for the true will of the people against a corrupt or out-of-touch elite. That framing, an authentic collective will versus a self-interested establishment supposedly distorting it, is straight out of Rousseau's playbook, whether or not the people using it have ever read a page of him. And the same old warning applies just as sharply today as it did in 1793. Whoever gets to define what the true will of the people actually is holds enormous, easily abused power, and reasonable people disagree fiercely, right now, about where that power is being used well and where it is being abused.
so where does that leave Rousseau's legacy, honestly, after all this?
Genuinely split, and that split is the whole point of taking him seriously instead of either worshipping or dismissing him. He gave modern political thought an enduring, powerful vision of legitimate government resting on the people rather than inherited authority, and a real vocabulary for critiquing inequality that still gets used today. He also handed history a dangerous tool for silencing dissent in the name of a supposedly higher collective will, a tool that has been picked up by both sincere Democrats and outright tyrants ever since. The honest motivational reason to actually read him is that his contradictions are not a flaw in the story. They are the story, freedom and tyranny, growing out of the very same root idea.
Which sets up a genuinely different kind of thinker for next time. Someone who takes Smith's economic ideas we covered earlier and pushes them into much sharper, more rigorous, more mathematical territory.
Where Rousseau was asking what makes a community's collective will legitimate, our next thinker is asking a narrower, colder, and in some ways more testable question: exactly how should nations trade with each other to make everyone genuinely richer?
Next time, David Ricardo, and the strange, still controversial idea that a country can benefit from trade, even when it is worse at making everything. See you then.